Silence is often seen as absence, as emptiness, but what if in truth it were the purest form of presence? When two souls can rest in each other's silence without discomfort, without the rush to fill the space with words, what emerges is not a void, but the fullness of a profound bond. There is something sacred in this shared silence, as if language were no longer needed for connection to exist. More than 1,000 declarations, the silence between two souls can be the truest testimony of a bond that transcends ego, fear, and masks. In this video, we'll dive into the foundations of Jungian psychology to understand why silence can be the highest degree of intimacy between two beings. And if you believe that true love goes beyond words, comment below, "My soul knows how to listen in silence." For Carl Gustav Jung, true connection between two souls is only possible when there is an authentic encounter between the self of each individual, that which transcends the ego, the persona, and unconscious projections. The silence between two people can represent that point of deep integration, where there is no longer a need for performances, justifications, or emotional noise. There, the presence of being in its wholeness resides. From the Jungian perspective, many relationships are shaped by projections, unconscious inner images we transfer onto the other, seeing in them qualities that actually belong to ourselves. Yet when two people can be silent together without the discomfort of expectation, it means those projections have begun to dissolve. The other is no longer just a reflection of what I lack, but is accepted as they truly are, an essential process in individuation. Moreover, shared silence directly touches the shadow. To sit in silence before someone without hiding our vulnerabilities is to accept our own darkness and that of the other. In this space beyond words, there is a tacit acceptance of the totality of being, including the conscious and the rejected, misunderstood or hidden aspects of the psyche. Finally, silence is also the fertile ground for the integration of inner opposites, the animus and anima, the masculine and feminine principles that live within each of us. When we grow still together, we allow these opposites to listen to each other and harmonize, creating a space of mutual healing. Thus, for Jung, silence is not the absence of communication, but a higher form of psychic presence and true love. At the heart of Carl Jung's analytical psychology lies the process of individuation, a continuous path toward the totality of being. This inner movement seeks to integrate the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, allowing the individual to become who they truly are, stripped of social masks, ego demands, and others' expectations. When two people walk this path, the relationship that forms between them transcends the conventional. At this point, silence becomes not only comfortable but sacred, a space where performance is no longer needed because both souls are present in their deepest authenticity. In most human interactions, silence is interpreted as an uncomfortable void, a gap that must be filled with words, gestures, or sounds. Yet this urge to fill silence often reveals our difficulty in being with ourselves. Before one can be silent with another, one must first learn to be silent within, to inhabit one's inner world without escape, distraction, or mask. This inner silence is the fruit of individuation, and when two people walking this path meet, they no longer demand from each other more than what can be given. Presence alone is enough. Individuation allows each person to embrace their uniqueness without depending on the other's presence to validate their existence. Thus, the relationship becomes an exchange between two centers, not an unconscious attempt at fusion or completion. When the other is seen as a necessary complement, a relationship of lack emerges, where silence is interpreted as rejection. But when the other is recognized as an entire universe choosing to share their existence, silence takes on new meaning. It becomes a bridge of respect, acceptance, and deep connection. In this context, silence is not a pause between conversations, but an active presence. It carries a quality of listening that goes beyond words, a listening of the soul. It's when you can look into someone's eyes and feel that there's nothing to prove, nothing to explain. This experience is rare because it requires emotional maturity, responsibility for one's own psyche, and, above all, the willingness to be whole before oneself and another. In the experience of two individuals who have become self-aware, silence does not represent distance but freedom from having to entertain, please, or convince. The silence shared by two souls who recognize each other on their journey of individuation reveals a profound trust, The trust that the bond does not depend on constant stimuli, but on a solid foundation built on inner truth. It is a love that doesn't shout, but sustains. That doesn't show off, but endures. Jung suggested that the true meeting between two souls occurs at the level of the self, the psychic instance that represents the regulating and total center of personality. The self does not speak through words, but through symbols, sensations, and often through silence. When two people meet from that inner place, words become secondary. The bond is woven by something subtler, more enduring, and less subject to the fluctuations of daily life. By understanding silence as an expression of individuation, we recognize that it is not absence but power, a fertile ground where authenticity can flourish, free from judgment and projection. In silence, each remains whole, and it is precisely for this reason that communion is possible. Nothing needs to be forced. Everything simply is. This kind of silence is only possible when both souls have learned to sustain their own company. And this is a direct fruit of individuation, the cultivation of an inner space where self-love is not narcissism, but conscious presence. When this love meets the love of another, something arises that does not need to be spoken of constantly. It simply exists. And within this silent being, there is a deeper proof of love than any declaration could offer. In Jungian psychology, projections play a central role in how we relate. They occur when unacknowledged aspects of our psyche, both light and shadow, are unconsciously cast onto another person. We project what we don't want, can't, or don't yet know how to integrate within ourselves. Thus, at the beginning of a relationship, we often don't see the person as they are, but as a screen where we paint our desires, fears, ideals, and needs. Though natural, this mechanism deeply distorts the perception of the other's reality. The relationship is built on inner images rather than true presence. That's why so many intense and promising connections eventually turn frustrating. The moment projection begins to dissolve is both painful and liberating, when enchantment gives way to truth. And few experiences encourage that dissolution as much as silence. Silence between two souls creates a neutral space, free from the noise of speech and the narratives that constantly reinforce our projections. When words cease, the ego's control over how we want to be seen and how we try to see the other also ceases. In that suspended space, the projected images lose strength. We begin to notice nuances in the other that were once blurred by the intensity of our own fantasies. Through silence, we give space for the other to reveal their essence, no longer as a reflection of our idealizations, but as a unique being, complex, with their own light and shadows. Silence allows the other's reality to emerge, and that's where projection begins to dissolve. Yet this process is not passive. It requires courage, the willingness to confront oneself and ask, what I see in the other, is it truly theirs, or is it mine? This kind of silence is not one of distance, indifference, or lack of intimacy. On the contrary, it's a dense silence, full of presence, where every gesture, every glance, every absence of speech carries meaning. It's in this space that we perceive when we're demanding from the other something we must find within ourselves. It's in this silence that idealized infatuation can transform into real love, no longer projected, but lived consciously. Jung stated that as long as we remain identified with our projections, we cannot truly love. We love the image we've created of the other, not the other themselves. True love begins when we can withdraw our projections and still choose to stay. And that rarely happens amid an excess of words or emotional control. It happens more often in silence, when we simply are with the other, without expecting them to save, complete, or validate us. The dissolution of projections in silence is also an invitation to self-observation. In another's silence, we are confronted with our own inner noise, our insecurities, expectations, and repetitive patterns. This discomfort is precious because it teaches us who we really are, beyond what we show. And by observing it without rushing to react, we create the opportunity to free ourselves from the unconscious bonds that imprison us. In silence, the masks fall, defenses soften. There's no way to hide for long before another's silent presence, and that is one of the most powerful forms of relational healing. When two people allow themselves to simply be together in silence, without pretense or imposition, they begin to see one another with new eyes, not the eyes of need, but of conscious presence. This experience, though subtle, is revolutionary. It breaks the relational paradigm based on fantasy and opens a new field of connection, one rooted in psychic maturity. And what begins to emerge in that field is a love that recognizes otherness, a love that doesn't demand perfection or completion, but embraces the other's humanity with respect. A love that doesn't need to be verbalized at every moment, because it is already present in the quality of the shared silence. When this happens, the relationship ceases to be a stage for our unconscious projections and becomes a living space for growth, truth, and transformation. And perhaps there is no greater proof of love than this, allowing the other to be who they are in silence and remaining there, present. The silence between two souls, when deep and true, can become a clear mirror revealing aspects we usually prefer to keep hidden, both from ourselves and from the other. This phenomenon, which on the surface appears to be merely a pause without words, is actually a direct portal to encountering the shadow, a key concept in Jungian psychology. Jung described the shadow as everything we do not recognize in ourselves: repressed impulses, denied traits, emotions we deem unacceptable or incompatible with our self-image. To sit in silence beside someone, especially someone with whom we share a deep bond, often brings up subtle yet intense discomforts. Silence, by not offering distraction, forces us to dive into our unconscious contents. It removes the veil of speech and puts us face to face with what we avoid seeing. When two people share this silence without escape or disguise, each begins to perceive within themselves the movement of their own shadow. In many relationships, moments of silence are quickly filled with compulsive talk, emotional justifications, or automatic gestures. This happens because silence in its purest state is unsettling. It exposes, it disarms. And when this exposure happens in the presence of another soul, we are compelled to face our emotional truth. Silence reveals the jealousy unacknowledged, the insecurity masked as pride, the need for control hidden beneath excessive care. The shadow surfaces and demands to be seen. But this confrontation need not be destructive. On the contrary, it can be deeply healing. For Jung, integrating the shadow is an essential step in individuation, and a relationship, when lived with maturity, becomes a privileged space for such integration. In shared silence, there is nowhere to run. What bothers us in the other is often a direct reflection of our own shadow. When that becomes conscious, we can transform discomfort into insight and conflict into growth. Once acknowledged, the shadow loses its destructive power. But this reconciliation is only possible when there is space to listen to it, and silence provides exactly that. Without the interference of rational discourse or the need to argue or justify, the shadow expresses itself more honestly. It reveals itself through bodily sensations, spontaneous memories, or silent judgments we project onto the other. All of this is psychic material that, if observed attentively, can lead to profound transformation. It's at this point that silence between two souls becomes a true instrument of evolution. When both are willing to sustain silence with courage and openness, they create a shared space where the shadow can be seen without judgment. The other ceases to be just a partner and becomes a mirror, one that reflects both the beauty and the unconscious depths within. And this reflection, though sometimes hard to face, is essential for emotional maturity. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The silence between two souls is often the moment when that darkness becomes visible, not as something to fear, but to embrace. True love does not fear the shadow. It recognizes it, embraces it, and walks with it. This is only possible when emotional maturity and the willingness to see beyond idealizations exist. When two people remain silent together, and even before the exposure of their shadows, choose to stay present, something extraordinary happens. The relationship strengthens, not because it becomes perfect, but because it becomes real. The bond formed at that level is more resilient, deeper, and more honest. It's not a love that denies darkness, but one that integrates it, becoming whole. In today's world, where communication is often noisy, superficial, and performative, such shared silence is rare. But when it happens, it's transformative. It reveals who we truly are and who the other truly is. And from that recognition arises the possibility of a love that transcends ego, that doesn't need words to affirm its existence, because it already manifests in the depth of presence and the courage to face what is hidden together. At the core of Jungian psychology lies the understanding that every human being carries within aspects of the opposite gender. In men, this inner aspect is called the anima, the inner feminine principle. In women, it is the animus, the inner masculine principle. These archetypes are not merely psychological traits, but living representations of the soul's totality. Integrating them is fundamental to the process of individuation, and human relationships, especially romantic ones, provide the most fertile ground for that integration. Interestingly, it's in shared silence between two souls that this process reveals itself most clearly and deeply. Silence, by suspending the need for control, argument, or explanation, turns us inward. It interrupts the rational, linear, analytical flow of an inflated animus, and simultaneously calms the diffuse emotionality characteristic of an unbalanced anima. When two people enter this space of pause and presence together, they create conditions for their inner aspects, animus and anima, to communicate on another level, symbolic, archetypal, essential. This inner dialogue can only occur when the ego steps aside. And silence is one of the most effective ways to dissolve the ego's barriers. Without the constant interference of speech and rationalization, we begin to hear our inner world. The woman, in silence, starts to perceive her animus, her rigid opinions, automatic judgments, absolute certainties. The man begins to feel his anima, his subtle emotions, unspoken fantasies, deep longing for connection. This recognition is often wordless, yet profoundly transformative. When two souls meet in silence and can sustain that presence without falling into projection or dependency, something magical happens. It's not only the other who is present, but also the archetypes within each. The woman sees in the man something beyond the physical, her own inner feminine reflected. The man, looking at the woman, recognizes in her a bridge to his own unconscious. And this perception cannot be easily expressed through words. It vibrates intensely in the shared silence. Silence allows the relationship to be not only external but internal. The woman listens to her animus in how she interprets the other's silence. Does she hear judgment, absence, criticism, or can she simply be without controlling its meaning? The man feels his anima reacting to his partner's silence. Does he feel rejected, abandoned, or can he remain simply present? These responses reveal the degree of inner archetypal integration. Jung warned that when the animus or anima are not integrated, they manifest negatively. The critical, argumentative, domineering animus, the volatile, manipulative, overly emotional anima. In relationships, these poorly integrated aspects cause conflict, hurt, and rupture. But when acknowledged and embraced consciously, they become allies in building healthier, more authentic bonds. Silence, then, is a silent teacher. It clearly points to where internal imbalance still exists. If in another's silence we feel anger, abandonment, or the need to fill the space with words, that reveals that the dialogue between our inner masculine and feminine is still distorted. Conversely, if we can sustain that silence with calm, deep listening and surrender, it means the inner opposites are learning to harmonize. This integration doesn't erase differences between masculine and feminine, but allows these poles to cooperate within us. When that happens, outer relationships change. They become less about need and more about presence, less about conflict and more about communion. The silence between two souls at that stage is so charged with meaning that it needs no explanation. It becomes a field where the soul can breathe, where love can simply exist. More than any romantic speech, the silence born from the integration of animus and anima is a testimony of spiritual and emotional maturity. It's a silence that doesn't wound, doesn't accuse, doesn't demand. It's a silence that welcomes, heals, and sustains. It becomes the space where love ceases to be idealized and begins to be lived, deeply, wholly, truthfully. When two people can meet in this kind of silence, they are not only communicating with each other, but also with their inner worlds. They are symbolically allowing their archetypes to listen, understand, and integrate. And perhaps there is no more powerful demonstration of love than this, to remain silent, side by side, without needing to be more than you are, because everything is already there, whole, true, and at peace. When the silence between two souls is understood through the light of analytical psychology, it ceases to be an empty space and becomes a living field of transformation. As we've seen, this silence does not represent distance, but deep communion between two beings walking toward their own totality. It is the silent proof that the relationship is not sustained by need, but by conscious presence, not by idealization, but by truth emerging when egos grow still. Throughout this video, we've explored how silence reveals the authenticity of individuation, dissolves projections, exposes the shadow, and integrates inner opposites. And in each of these processes, true love manifests not as noise or emotional intensity, but as a steady, silent presence that embraces the other in their wholeness. If this content has touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring deep reflections about the soul, consciousness, and relationships. And don't forget to watch the video appearing now on your screen. It complements this journey and can expand your understanding of the power of silence and presence even further. Because sometimes, to love is simply to know how to stay in silence.